Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lucy, and I work at the Mississauga Library, and tonight it's my privilege to host this event. If you're having any technical difficulties, please message me or my colleague Elizabeth in the chat box. Welcome to our virtual program, Lecture Me. Tonight, our speaker is University of Toronto at Mississauga Professor Rafael Chiuzi, and he will be talking about Exprocity, the surprising science behind effective team performance. We always begin with the land acknowledgement, which I'll read. We acknowledge the lands which constitute the present-day city of Mississauga as being part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and Wyandot nations. We recognize these peoples and their ancestors as people who inhabited these lands since time immemorial. The city of Mississauga is home to many global Indigenous peoples. As a municipality, the City of Mississauga is actively working towards reconciliation by confronting our past, our present, providing space for Indigenous peoples within their territory to recognize and uphold their treaty rights and to support Indigenous peoples. We formally recognize the Anishinaabe origins of our name and continue to make Mississauga a safe space for all Indigenous peoples. And now I'm going to give you a really quick overview of WebEx. On your screen, you'll see there's a chat box on the right-hand side with the blue arrow. You can select to message the host or panelists. You can share your questions and comments during the program using this feature. Questions will only be answered at the end of the professor's talk. Also, to let you know, closed captioning is available for this program. It's enabled. You can turn captioning on or off by clicking on the CC button in the bottom left-hand corner indicated by the yellow rectangle. Once the captioning is turned on, you can also adjust the font size or change the background color to light or dark by clicking on the three dots at the end of the black bar that appears. The box in the middle with the green arrows is for reactions. Let us know how you feel about what is being shared and feel free to interact. Many of the 24/7 digital services offered by Mississauga Library are available for free with your library card and also available from your home. We offer a large collection of ebooks and audiobooks through Libby by Overdrive and Hoopla. Hoopla also offers music, movies, TV shows, and comics. You can access digital magazines through Flipster and RP Digital for magazines. Press Reader has newspapers from all over the world in more than 60 languages. Free downloadable streamable music is available through Freegal, and you can learn a huge number of languages on Mango Languages. LinkedIn Learning offers opportunities to learn all kinds of new skills, everything from 3D animation, finance, and even writing skills. Please visit the library website or call us for details. Library newsletters are a nice way to find out what's happening at the library and other interesting news. Sign up for weekly newsletters so you can learn more about our upcoming programs and services. Our next Lecture Me program will be on March 7th, and Professor Daya will be talking about learning technology systems in everyday life, women's experiences navigating refugee resettlement. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to Rima Chakra from UTM, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Rima Chakra. I'm from the Experiential Education Unit, Office of the Vice Principal Academic and Dean at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, welcome to our Lecture Me talk featuring Professor Rafael Chiuzi from the Department of Management. Dr. Chiuzi is an accomplished organizational psychologist with a strong demonstrated capacity to leverage human capital for the benefit of organizations and people alike. In his 15 years of innovation practice in North and South America and the Middle East, he has been able to overcome widespread organizational challenges and successfully implement lasting and meaningful changes. Dr. Raphael is also a published author and a two-time TEDx speaker. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Rafael Chiuzi. Over to you.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I would like to start by first thanking this invitation I love libraries, so anything that has to do with libraries, I'm in. And if you're watching this talk while having dinner, I hope you have a pleasant dinner. Um, and don't let me bore you too much with my stuff, okay? So I have prepared a few things that I would like to share with you. It's one of those things. Um, it's one of the very few moments where we get to feel a little bit important as a researcher because we get to share our geekness and all of our nerdiness with a broader audience. So I appreciate you, and I really appreciate you giving me the time to talk about this stuff. So hopefully this will resonate with some of you, and I'm completely biased towards my own research, as you can imagine. So the name of this talk, and I'm going to share my screen here so I can keep myself on track. So the name of this talk is Exprocity. I'm gonna walk you through what this means. Okay. And let me start by I have a few of my students, I guess, watching me, and they know this. I really enjoy watching movies and series, and a lot of my references they come from that stuff. So I'll start with two scenes from two different movies. Okay, the first one is from the movie The Pursuit of Happiness with featuring Will Smith, where he plays the real life entrepreneur Chris Gardner, which is a phenomenal character. Um, and there is one particular scene. Will's character, I'm gonna call him Chris. He's walking through a fancy neighborhood, and he has his son with him. Um, if you have seen the movie, you know that Mr. Gardner was financially struggling and homeless at a certain point in his life. So his son is asking him if they can go watch a football game live. And to that, Chris replies, I said we're possibly going to the game. Do you know what possibly means? And the little boy replies, like probably? And then Chris rebates, no, probably means there's a good chance we're going. Possibly means we might not. Now, do you know what possibly means? And the little boy, if he's visibly frustrated, he says, I know what it means, okay? It means we're not going to the game. And then his dad is laughing. He's like, how did you get so smart? So that's scene number one. And the second scene is a very classic scene from the movie The Breakup. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but it features Jennifer Aniston and Vince Vaughn. And the characters are Brooke and Gary, right? And I'm gonna call them Brooke and Gary. So they are a married couple, and they're hosting a dinner party for their families. And Gary was supposed the whole thing starts with Gary was supposed to bring 12 lemons for the centerpiece decoration, but he only brought like 3 lemons. Now the dinner goes on and it's filled with very awkward moments. And after everyone leaves, that's the scene. Brooke wants to get the dishes done. And she tells Gary, it would be really nice if you could help me. And to which he replies, no problem, we'll get them later. And he, by the way, he's playing video game in the couch. So Brooke insists, saying she doesn't like to wake up to a dirty kitchen, and this is a pivotal moment in the scene. Gary replies, who cares? And she just goes ballistic. Like, I care, I care. He's laying down on the couch, his shoes on, he's playing video games. And Brooke is saying how much she worked for this dinner and how much she just wants to finish it. So Gary throws the remote control away and says, okay, fine, let's do the damn dishes. And then she says, no, you know what? No. I want you to want to do the dishes. And that's fascinating. Gary says, well, why would I want to do the dishes? He's visibly confused. Are you telling me that you're upset because I don't have a strong desire to do the dishes? And she says, no, I am upset because you don't have a strong desire to offer to do the dishes. And the discussion goes on and on. The argument drifts from lemons and dishes to a more deeply profound aspect of the relationship. What do I do for you? What do you do for me? And the movie ends. I'm sorry if I'm spoiling, but the movie ends with the couple breaking up. Now, the common thing between these two scenes is the presence of expectations. So both the little boy and Brooke had certain expectations. Both of them had those expectations frustrated, but in a very different manner. In the movie, in the pursuit of happiness, they end up being lucky and they were invited to watch the game, exceeding expectations because they are in a very luxurious box seat. So it's very fancy. But I always play an alternative scenario in my head when I watch that movie. If Chris, after visiting the potential client, it's the guy who took him to the game, um, has to walk home and tell his son that unfortunately they cannot go to the game. Now I'm imagining the little boy would be frustrated, of course, but the intensity would be much different because of the talk that happened earlier. Now, this happens to all of us humans multiple times a day, but we don't think about them at all times because some expectations don't impact us in a major way. For example, picture yourself in a summer and the weather forecast says you'll have a sunny day tomorrow with a slight chance of rain. If there's one thing that we Canadians love doing, it is talking about the weather. So bear with me. So you have your picnic plan. The next day you wake up and you notice the rain on your window. So you're upset. Yes, there's a feeling of frustration, but you do understand that this could happen. And then you change your plans, right? You're going to do something else. However, some frustrations are much more severe than this one. And this is what I want to talk about. Picture this. So I'm married, right? And we have two kids. So picture this. I'm at work at U of T. My wife calls me. Look, I'm home. I am feeling super sick. I don't know what happened. It's bad. I know we had the dinner party with our friends tonight. I'm sorry, but I'm feeling horrible. Now picture this. I go to my wife and I said, honey, don't worry. Look, I'll go home. I will take a shower. You don't come near me because I don't want to catch that bug. You stay with the kids and I'll go to the dinner. Now, how do you think that story is going to end up for me? How many nights do you think I'm going to be sleeping in the couch or the doghouse? See, that's what I'm talking about. Or let's switch from personal life to professional life. Let's say your boss comes up to you and say, "Look, the client, super demanding client, we have to deliver this report and it has to be done this week by the end of this week because the board meeting is on Monday. So, could you please stay with me working late Friday nights because this is super important?" And you say, "You know what? Okay, I'll do it." So you call your family, look, don't wait for me, cancel whatever plans we have. You stay and 2 a.m., you finish the report, super happy, um, go home and everything looks great. Then one day you go to your boss and said, look, I'm out of personal days, I'm out of sick days, but I really need this. I need to take care of a family issue. Can you give me this day off? And your boss turns to you and says, I'm sorry, but I can't. I have to be fair with everybody on the team. Like, how am I going to explain that to the team? So no, unfortunately not. See, there is something like you don't know my wife, and I'm assuming you don't know my wife. You don't know this boss, but there's something terribly, terribly off here. So why does this happen? That was my question. So as an organizational psychologist, I was particularly interested in studying this phenomenon in teams and their leaders. And my research specifically covered the role of those invisible phenomena between, those leaders and their teams at work. And I've studied multiple teams across many industries. I did manufacturing, hospitality, mining, logistics, healthcare, because I wanted to be as broad as possible. And I also studied teams from supervisors, like first supervisors, all the way to executive directors. Because I wanted to check if there's any difference between, those hierarchical levels. So the premise is that in every human relationship that exists for a prolonged time, marriage, friendship, working relationship, a psychological contract is formed. And this contract is unspoken, is implicit and informal, yet it has a lot of power when steering expectations. So if you allow me to do a shameless self promotion here, I'm going to use my quote that I developed based on the theory, is that the work psychological contracts are this set of mutual obligations between your employer and employees, and it's subjective, it is dynamic, and it's mostly an implied phenomenon present in this professional relationship. And there's more, because this psychological contract is based on reciprocity between the parties and is established because you commit yourself with future intent of actions, attitudes, and behaviors. So I said, okay, nice. Now I have a problem. How am I going to study this? So to achieve this goal, let me try to illustrate in this poorly designed slide here, if you can see it. So to achieve this goal, I had to make sure that individuals, team members, didn't communicate with each other, team members and leaders, okay? Oh, by the way, in case you're wondering, my heritage is Italian, so I speak a lot with my hands, so bear with me. So whenever I visited an organization, I had leaders in one location, it's like this lady here, and I had the teams in a separate location, and they couldn't communicate with each other, normally a meeting room. And I would ask them the very same questions. So to the leaders, I would ask them, what do you expect from your team? And the second question would be, what can they expect from you in this working relationship? And then I would go to the other room and I would ask the same question to the team members. What do you expect from your leaders or this leader? I don't know. And I would use the name in the case of a manager or director. And what can, Joe, Siddhartha expect from you in this working relationship? Now, the results were fascinating. Fascinating. In some teams, there was a clear match between this alignment, the expectations between leaders and the team members, to the point where some of them would use the same words to describe their relationship and how they work together, the same vocabulary. Now, these teams also were the ones who reported higher levels of satisfaction with the leadership, better cohesion among their peers, and more perceived effectiveness when performing their duties at work. So the team gelled better. I remember one particular participant, he said to me that he was so aware of what his boss expected of him and vice versa, that he knew that certain decisions he could make it on the spot because he could anticipate that his boss would say the same thing. And that would give him a feeling of autonomy and respect at work. However, in some teams, the results were the opposite. The mismatch between team members and their leaders, it was so wide that leaders would constantly express how frustrated they were and they would often blame on capabilities. And guess what? I was talking to the teams, and they would often report a sense of insecurity about, I don't know what to do, about next steps, which would cause them to constantly wait on the boss to make all the decisions so they could escape accountability. In those teams, the leaders constantly complain about how their teams never took responsibility for anything, how they lacked initiative. And as you can imagine, those teams reported the lowest levels of satisfaction with leadership, lower cohesion between the peers. There was a lot of competition going between them, and a much, much lower perceived effectiveness in their duties. Now, here's what's interesting. When you look at the scenario here, some teams were a clear match, but you got to remember, this is all in this cloud here. It's all very implied. It's all unknown. Those things are largely unspoken. This is what makes this thing so tricky. Now, I know what the majority of you are probably thinking. This is just a communication issue. And I thought that at first too. I was like, okay, this is a miscommunication issue. But what I found out when I was analyzing the data just blew my mind. The communication between leaders and their teams was not the determinant factor causing the alignment or the misalignment. Some leaders in the lowest performing teams, they constantly communicated with their teams. They had a lot of meetings, a lot of memos, a lot of emails flying around, and vice versa. The issue was not the communication. Let's go back to the movie scene, Brooke and Gary. They were communicating. It was not about the communication. It was not Brooke asking Gary to do the dishes. It was about her wanting him to want to do the dishes. So it was not about the leaders communicating with their teams or teams communicating with their leaders. It was about the very architecture of their relationship that made the difference. It was about all the expectations hovering around that relationship. It was also about how much each individual in those teams believed they were adding to that relationship, bringing their stuff to the table. And what was that role in moving forward? So, in other words, it was the combination between the expectations and the reciprocity in that relationship. And this very thing I very cleverly, as you can see, there's a lot of creative brain going on here that just dubbed Exprocity, which is this combination between those two fundamental elements in that relationship. Now, to understand what that combination looks like, we need to understand a little bit of both. So I'll try my best to give you like a little bit of a crash course on it, okay? So when we talk about expectations, when you look at sociology, and we have to borrow concepts from everywhere, right? Not just psychology, but sociology, management, and all that. So you look like Weber and George Mead and Schultz. They believed that looking towards the future, it's a very natural part of human behavior. And our decisions, our actions, they are shaped by our very own thoughts and plans for what's to come. So it's not just about reacting to the past or what's happening in our lives right now, but it's also about actively shaping what's going to happen in our future. And this goes for individuals, this goes for groups, organizations, and society. So what I'm about to tell you is something that was very interesting to me when I look at the research is expectations. They are much more than just descriptions of what might happen in this human nature element. They actually play a role in shaping our reality. So it's not just about predicting the future, but it's more about creating it. So for example, when you say, yes, I'll bring it to you tomorrow, that's not just a statement about what might happen. Instantly, that expectation creates an obligation. And I hope that is making sense to you. Picture yourself, I'm going to give you a personal example. We have to do bathroom renovations now. Not because we're fancy, it's just because we have a bunch of leaks in here and we have to fix it. Anyway. So picture yourself like I'm doing right now, hiring a contractor for this bathroom renovation. You immediately conjure action when you're giving a quote and a deadline. So my guy just told me, he's like, 2 weeks, I'm going to get it all done. You see your new bathroom ready in 2 weeks. You see yourself paying the invoice, and this whole scene evokes emotions, evokes anticipation. Let me give you another example. This was a very interesting Australian study. It was done by Johnson and some colleagues in 2021. So here's what they did. They took 25 secondary school students and they observed these students interacting with their various learning area teachers in 3 different schools in Australia. And they did like more than 100 interviews, over 170 class observations. They wanted to research, this is what they wanted to look, how grade 10 students experience their teachers' expectations in ways that would impact their academic outcomes. So this paper concludes that teacher expectations have a significant impact on student academic outcomes. And they found that when teachers communicate high expectations in ways in which instill confidence, security, students were more likely to believe that they can succeed and act accordingly. And that's how powerful it was. Those students had higher grades. And of course, if you look back on history, it's what we call the Pygmalion effect, or in the role that expectations play when we have a relationship, especially in education. So this is how powerful expectations are. It's not just about describing, it's about shaping what's about to happen. It's about anticipation and creating this reality. Okay, cool. So what about the other one? What about reciprocity? What is its role in this whole equation? And we learn reciprocity from a very tender age. I mean, look, I tell my kids this. Sharing is caring. Have you ever, for those of you who have kids, did you ever say that? Sharing is caring. What you're really saying is, look, between us adults here in this room, what you're really saying is, you will have a turn, play with it. And in reciprocity, you will also let the other kid have a turn when you're finished. Ideally, we're going to have the same time distribution between you. Or later on, we hear like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Tit for tat. That's so we learn reciprocity from a really, really tender age. Up until recently, and this is just curiosity here, we thought that humans were the only species with a prominent cognitive capacity to reciprocate. But I found this study. It was done by researchers at the Yerkes National Primate Research Center at Emory University. They found out that monkeys may gain the advantages of reciprocal exchange of favors. And this is fascinating. As primates, they used what we call a pro-social choice test to study whether direct reciprocity could promote generosity among, I believe the monkeys were like brown capuchin monkeys and all that. But look, We're talking about a species that recognizes that if I help you, then you should help me, and vice versa. And this makes us stronger as a collective. And they found out that monkeys were willing to do another monkey's favor and became more pro-social as long as they could alternate and help each other. That's mind-blowing, isn't it? The American Psychological Association, they define reciprocity roughly as a process or a relationship in which one person receives a benefit from or benefits from another person. And in return, it provides an equivalent benefit. It doesn't have to be the same benefit, but it has to be equivalent. And this is, if you really want to geek it out, this whole thing is called heteromorphic and homomorphic reciprocity. So I like this very cool cat named Alvin Goldner. He was an American sociologist, and I use him a lot in my research. He was the first one to say that there's a common, universal, almost universal norm of reciprocity in almost every society that we know. And this norm tells us that we should help others who have helped us, or at least not to harm them. And there may be consequences if we don't follow through. The only exception, he says in his original work, this is fascinating, are the very young, the old, and the sick. Like, imagine when you help a sick person, in a hospice, you're not expecting anything in return. You're just doing out of goodwill. So he said, but overall, we expect that a general reciprocity would call for a positive response to a good treatment and a negative response to a bad treatment. This is probably where the an eye for an eye saying came from. Now think about how important this is, because the norm of reciprocity has a major impact in our social lives, right? Think about your friendship, think about your marriage, think about your working relationships. It helps keep social groups and relationships kind of stable. So it's helpful in a way that it helps to build strong relationships, new connections, and it can be a very positive starting point for creating a long-lasting social ties. I have a friend, and he's an avid hockey player, and whenever he wants to describe another friend who was very keen on reciprocate, he said, "That dude is solid. That dude is solid." What he's trying to say is, if I have his back, he has mine, and there's the relationship ongoing. And that goes for every single relationship we have in our lives. So what I did when I was putting together this, let me share with you the kind of a aspiring equation that I found out. And this equation is reciprocity multiplied by the expectations that you have will create a perceived obligation. Okay, I'm going to walk you through. Let's take an example at work, since we're talking about this at work. Whenever you bring or you add something to the relationship, skills, hard work, staying late, going the extra mile, an instant perception of reciprocity is created. So the more you have expectations about that relationship, either because this workplace is famous for promoting from within, or advertises that they care about sustainability and inclusion, the more this perceived obligation is fomented. So what happens is, let me give you an example. You need to look at here, like let's say you're working and you have a strong work ethic, you're going the extra mile, you're deeply engaged, and you're doing all the right stuff. And let's say you have high expectations for this relationship. So you're more invested in that relationship. That means you are indeed a perceived obligation was created in your cognitive system. So that means you're expecting a promotion or a pay raise or to be fast tracked or to given extra opportunities for professional developments. You're expecting more respect, a good work environment, and so on and so forth. Now, here's the thing. Most people, they are familiar with this concept in a negative way. This is when the Exprocity equation becomes very evident. Whenever this perceived obligation here is frustrated, in other words, when there is a breach or a rupture in a psychological contract, people experience very negative emotions like anger, frustration, sadness, feeling of betrayal. And the employees who perceive the breaches in this psychological contract with their employers, they tend to be more skeptical. They tend to exhibit greater levels of what they call deviant behaviors, unethical behaviors. They show greater resistance to change, and of course, a higher likelihood to leave that workplace. Look, here's a very common story from a colleague, and I'm going to share with you. She gave me permission to share this story with you. We were chatting about Exprocity one day, and I'm going to call her Linda. It's not her real name, but I'm going to call her Linda. And Linda, she works for a marketing company. She is, she, she was telling me this in the past, but highly regarded by her boss and peers. Constantly, people ask her for her opinion. She's constantly involved in leading projects, and her direct supervisor gives her lots of autonomy at work. Linda is, she's doing fantastic. So, despite the fact that Linda is not the most senior employee in the department, she knows from previous past company history that this is not an actual barrier for a promotion. She knows a lot of people who were promoted in a very short period of time just because of their performance. So that kind of story goes around in the company, right? Her friends tease her during lunch, saying, "Oh, you're gonna be the next boss very soon. Don't forget the little people." And this is all happening at Linda's head in her perception. So Linda thinks to herself, "Look, I've been working really hard. All the signs are there. My boss is happy. My peers respect me. I'm involved with all the right projects. My deliveries are above average. I'm cautiously optimistic about getting that promotion." She told me that. This is what Linda tells to herself. Cautiously optimistic. But look, between us here, we know what's happening, don't we? We know what Linda's really thinking. She is expecting a high level of reciprocation. She has a lot of expectation. This is exponential. In Linda's head, there is a perceived obligation was formed, even if she doesn't want to admit it. So on a given day, Linda's called to a meeting. She goes to the elevator. She can feel like the tingling in her hands and the excitement, the anticipation. She tells herself, calm down. This is just probably nothing, just another meeting. Still, deep down, she's crawling with this, the expectation of receiving the recognition. She enters the room, very nice smile. It turns out the meeting was just another meeting. The director just wanted to know the status on a given project. And Linda, she tells me that she felt like the air was sucked out of the room. And the ride down on the elevator was nothing like the ride up. She cannot smile, and she's thinking, how can this day get any worse? And she thinks in a very frustrated voice on the way to her office, how can this day get any worse? Well, it could get worse. When she goes out of the elevator, one of her good friends comes running toward her and say, Oh, by the look on your face, I guess you already know, and I don't blame you for being mad. And Linda says, what the hell are you talking about? And her friend says, the new guy, right? That's what you're mad about. How could they hire an outsider when you're clearly more qualified than him? And Linda felt her stomach just drop faster than the elevator. She immediately calls her boss. It's like, what's happening? Her boss goes, I'm sorry you heard the news like this. I wanted to have this conversation with you in person, but I guess the gossip was faster than me. Linda now had the awful confirmation that is true. She was not promoted. And not only that, the boss keeps going. It's like, look, you're a stellar professional, Linda. The decision was not up to me. It was more political than I would like it to be. But if you can continue the performance like you have been, in no time, you're going to get rewarded. Now, Linda was telling me her first instinct was like, rip the phone off the station, get the keyboard, and just smash it against the computer screen. But she said, I didn't do that. She said, okay, thank you. She tried to remain calm and do her work, but the feeling of betrayal was just unbearable. She quit her job, by the way, 2 months after all this happened. Now let me go back to the equation here, right? Look at the equation. No, nobody really promised officially Linda that she would get the promotion. Now, no official communication was made. Still, that doesn't make the situation less real, does it? And this is how powerful Exprocity is. So what then? How is this applicable? And I know that some of you might be thinking, okay, I'm in a leadership position, and what now? And the thing is, back in the day, you didn't have to worry about this if you were a leader. I pay your salary. If you don't like it, there's the door, right? But nowadays, leaders cannot afford this anymore. And you got to remember, salary and job descriptions are just a baseline. So there's a new contract in place that demands you not only to be great with what they have to do technically, but you have to be great with people. And in my research, I noticed that the managers with this old mindset were also the ones with very little awareness of this mismatch between them and their teams. And this is usually a very common mistake that I see. Leaders who think that the game is played using the job description, the pay grades, the badges, and the titles. Great leaders know they operate in a much more subtle, invisible level where the game is played in nuances. It's not 0 and 1. And if you believe your team should respect you only because of your job title or how much time you have worked in this company, oof, you are sadly mistaken. So here's an analogy that I think it summarizes this whole thing. Imagine, let me switch the slide here. Imagine that the relationship between leaders and their teams are like a piggy bank. Okay, but this piggy bank is open. There's no, this is quite open here. So that means anyone can deposit or remove a coin anytime. And those coins are favors, exceptions, and all that stuff. Every time a leader asks for a favor or something out of your job description, which happens more often than the regular stuff, we all know this, he or she is taking a coin for themselves, right? Remove from the piggy bank, I take it for myself because it's benefiting me. And the team is watching. The team is not only watching, they're keeping tabs of how much you're taking out. Immediately, there is an imbalance in the situation. In other words, a perceived obligation was immediately created because now the team expects the leader to reciprocate at some level. Whenever the leader reciprocates the favor, puts a coin back into the piggy, the relationship normalizes again. But more than that, it's almost like this leader increased his or her credit score with the team, right? Like we're familiar with the credit score. So every time they take it and they pay it back, the credit score goes up. They're building credibility. And the very same thing happens to the team members. Taking coins, leaders are keeping tabs. You keep a close eye on that. When they pay it back, it boosts their credit score, their credibility. And that's the way solid relationships are forged. That's how high performing teams operate. They have high credit scores. The Exprocity equation between them is very well balanced. So if leaders only take away coins from the piggy bank, then their teams will play the same game. And it becomes very transactional. That's when people are doing the quiet quitting. You know, I'm only going to do the bare minimum not to get fired, and that's it. So this relationship becomes exclusively transactional, which means there's zero room for any exceptions. And that is the place where teams go to die. Because if there's one thing we know now, is that in today's business environment, is exceptions are more common than the norm, right? More common than we think. And if your team is not equipped or doesn't want to operate outside the traditional boundaries, you as a leader, you are in deep trouble. So why don't leaders try and manage Exprocity more? And I have two untested hypotheses here. First, maybe they are unaware of this dynamic. And hopefully this talk can inspire some of you to work on those. But second, and I believe this is the more common, they are afraid of doing so. I remember I was facilitating a workshop the other day, and a senior director of a logistics company, he said, well, if I call my people to talk about that, expectations and risk, I'm afraid I will be creating expectations. This is a valid concern. And then I said to him, I have some bad news for you. The expectations are already there. And they were created, this perceived obligation was already created, whether you like it or not, my friend. So the question now becomes, are you aware of them? Do you know what they are? So you can be Brooke and Gary, or you can be Chris Gardner and his son. If we could rewrite the scene with Brooke and Gary in the movie, but let's say this time Gary, he was watching the lecture me talk, and he said, as soon as the dinner is over, he goes to Brooke and says, dinner was great, honey. I know how hard you work for this. Why don't you let me do the dishes and you can go rest. You can go take a shower. I am pretty sure the movie's name wouldn't be The Breakup anymore. And imagine the opposite. If Chris, instead of saying possibly and maybe, he would say to his little boy, of course we're going to watch the game soon. You can count on that. The end result would probably be very, very different. Anyway, this is just the tip of the iceberg on this whole thing. And there's much more I wish I could talk to you about. I'm just going to leave my contact information here. There's my website, my Twitter account, and my LinkedIn. I just wanted to, again, thank you for the invitation. I'm very curious about the kind of questions that you should have for me. I'm going to stop talking now. Thanks again.
Most amazingly, I think everybody has been listening to you, Professor Chiuzi, and nobody's asked any questions at all. There's nothing in the chat whatsoever. The tip of the iceberg. Do you want to sort of go underneath the tip of the iceberg, and maybe someone will come up with some questions?
Yes, that's a good segue. I think what I mean by the tip of the iceberg is not just, this is a common mistake that I see. People tend to confuse this whole thing with just communicate. So we need to communicate more. And it's not about communication. You can have hundreds of meetings with your teams. But if you don't understand what is the underlying issue going around, that, the cloud that I use, the foggy aspect, the gray area, if you cannot understand what's happening there, then it doesn't matter how many meetings or emails you have with your team. So my best advice to you would be, you have to go there and you have to talk about that stuff. Because if you don't, it's gonna remain largely implicit, unspoken. And then you got to remember, people don't have a crystal ball. They don't know what you're thinking. And unless you ask them or you offer them, you give them permission to talk about that stuff, then this is a good way to start.
Okay, there are some questions starting to come in now. I love the first question. It sounds very transactional, but we're going to move it away from that. The question is, how do you increase your credit score with your team?
Oh, that's good. I like that. Um, and Nathan, this is a great question. I would say, unlike our monetary system, you've got to understand what is the currency first. So let me give you an example. Whenever my first executive experience, I was very young, very stupid. I was, in my 20s, and I wish I could go back and redo some of the things. You have to understand what is the currency between that you and that team. So, for example, it could be that the currency is tenure. Your the time you spend in that company worth more than your expertise. In some companies, like when you take the startup environment, it's very different. It doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, what industry you come from. It's about your skill, your expertise, what you bring to the table. So understand what's the currency first, and then if you are, and Nathan, I'm assuming if you are in a leadership position, you cannot forget that you must reciprocate. If you're asking team for favors, it will come back to you. They will ask you for favors. This is the example I gave you. Work until 2 a.m. The norm of reciprocity will tell everybody here the minimum you should do is, of course, take the day off by all means. The minimum I should do with the example I gave about my wife is no, no, no. Look, I'm going to stay home. I'll cancel the dinner party. I'll make you a soup. I'll take care of the kids. That's not written anywhere, but that's the contract. It is expected for me to do that. And we both know, even though I didn't sign anything when I got married with her, it's the currency. So understanding that is a very good start.
Now we're flooded with questions. The next question, what key advice would you provide to a manager who's leading a new team?
Oh, I love that question because one of the teams in my research, Rena, it was that case. So I had a new manager fresh to the team. And I'm talking like weeks, like 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And I was like, okay, that's going to be interesting. So when I was chatting with her, and I'm going to apologize to I'm being too informal. I was interviewing her, but I like to think of it as a chat. So I told her, it's like, okay, so what do you think your team is expecting of you? She said, that's an excellent question. I have no idea. So after the interview was over, my research was published and everything. I was following up with some of my interviewees, and I called her, and her name was Katya. She's a fantastic manager. I said, so what happened? She said, after the interview, I decided to go and ask the team this very question. And the results were just amazing because I had no idea they were expecting of me some of the things that they told me because of the history that they had with the previous managers, which was disastrous. So they were talking about, okay, how we're gonna do when one of us is late, how we're gonna do when one of us is sick, how we're gonna do with, how we're gonna manage exceptions. So she actively discussed with her team, and this is my would be my advice to you, Rena. Don't be too afraid of going there and having that discussion. It doesn't have to be an official formal discussion. It could be over coffee or a lunch with someone on your team. But if you use those two questions, what do you expect of me? What can I expect of you? Vice versa. I think that's more than halfway.
I really want to hear your answer to this next question. Should employees lower expectations to avoid severe disappointment?
Wow, so many great questions. Jude, my core finding on my research was this. the model that I propose is exactly showing that, unlike what previous researchers had tell us, they had told us that it was a very rigid contract. I said, no, this is not what I found out in my research. What I actually found out is this Exprocity equation is constantly changing. And we have this amazing capacity to calibrate expectations. Once you start, Jude, let's say you started in a new company, and then you're looking at how people are treated, you're looking at how things are really when you start working there, and you say, oh, this expectation that I had, scratch that, it's not going to happen. Can I live with that? Yeah, I can live with that. This is what we call a drift. Not a breach, it's a drift. But the opposite also happens. It's like, oh, I didn't know I could expect this. This is nice. I'm going to add that to this list of my psychological contracts. So the answer is yes, we can do this. It's flexible enough for us to do re-editions of the psychological contract as we progress in this company. That's such a great question.
So contracts can be reviewed constantly.
They do. My proposal is that they work in an addition and re-editions as things progress, because companies change, right? All of a sudden you're required. All of a sudden you have a new boss. All of a sudden there's an M&A process, or there's a major regulation that happened and it's going to impact the business. People can adapt. Now, for some of them, might be unbearable. If the rupture is too much, they'll probably leave the company, or they're going to start looking for another job. But for some, they're going to say, yeah, I kind of expected that.
The next couple questions are not so much about the leader, but the team. And what advice would you give to team members, and how would you foster reciprocity in the team?
That is something that teams are really good at that. Especially when they work together for quite a while, this contract becomes very, very solid, very robust. Because the more time you spend with someone, it's like a marriage. The more you understand the implicit rules in that relationship. So I would say the problem might be less on the team and more in the relationship that they have with leadership. Now, if your team, let's assume the team is new, like we're talking about um, a task force or a project team, which is, by definition, is going to cease to exist after a while. I strongly encourage you to discuss the things that people tend not to discuss. Mundane things like how we're going to communicate with each other, how we're going to deal with whenever we have a conflict in the team, how we're going to do when we need to push a meeting, or someone is going to be mad because we have conflicting opinions. If you can discuss this, like you create this group charter, then that's a nice way to negotiate this psychological contract, to understand the Exprocity agreement going on with that team.
It's interesting how you've said it's not about communication, but it is about communication.
Oh yeah, communication is the vessel, right? It's
Yeah.
what we use to deliver. But the most important part is what is going to be in that communication. That's the thing. So don't mistake communication with the number of meetings. Then, because some people, I hear that from managers all the time. I don't understand. I am telling my people in the meeting. My very good friend here, he works for the government. He's saying, look, I don't understand. We get out of a meeting. I told them this is what's going to happen. Still, sometimes it doesn't happen. And I have another meeting, a follow-up meeting, and I send an email, like bullet points from the meeting. Still doesn't happen. And we were having this conversation the other day. I was like, it's less about the meeting. They probably know what you mean, but there's something going around between you and your team that you're not aware. And that's the key point between mistakenly thinking that communication is going to solve everything. It's about how you're going to architecture that communication beforehand.
So it's the quality of the communication, not the
Oh,
quantity.
absolutely. Yes.
Okay, here's a very specific question about putting coins back in the piggy bank. Leanne wants to know what type of favors can be granted. What would work?
Yeah, that depends on the relationship. So, for example, the example that I gave in the talk, when the manager goes to the employee and say, I cannot open exceptions. I have to treat everybody equally. That's why I cannot give you the day off. See, that's a classic mistake. You cannot treat everybody equally. Never. Not even as parents. We don't have, the kids have the different parents. Like my first kid has a different parent than my second kid. Because that's just how relationship works. So how can you put coins back into the piggy bank? Like I told before, you have to understand the currency, but more important than that, what is the reciprocation going around here? Are we talking about effort? Are we talking about time? Is it something that it's within your power? Because, for example, if a team member comes up to you and say, I'm doing all these things and I want to be promoted, but if making him or her promoted is above your pay grade, then this is something that you have to make very, very clear. Correct? Because if you don't do this, or if you give the false impression, because we like power, false impression that you have a saying on this, when you don't, then you're way out of your depth. And that's when bad things happen. So you put the coin back by understanding what is the favor. Is it about time? Is it about resources? Is it about your time? Is it about making an exception for this team member? Because you can make exceptions for team members. You don't have to treat everybody 100% equally. That's not how relationships are made.
Now, about saying yes and no, Eckhart, I'm going to read this question out. If you always say yes when your boss asks you to do something, you create a contract that you will always step up. One day, if you have to say no, you break the contract. How does one handle the situation? Because one cannot always say yes.
Oh, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. So let's say when you're in this relationship, I would take a step back and say, why is this person always saying yes? Is she saying yes just because you're nice? Because let's say, for example, when it snows and I go and I clean my neighbor's driveway, I fully, because they're like an elderly couple. I don't expect them to get the shovel and come clean my driveway. I'm just doing because I feel like, selfishly, it makes me feel good about myself about helping them. But in a working relationship, this person is probably saying yes because there is an expectation going around. And here's the thing. If your boss doesn't know that this expectation is going, and you're assuming they know, that's the foggy area that I was mentioning. So how do you handle this situation? You have to have more honest conversations about this. So let's say I'm assuming that by saying yes every time, I'm assuming I want to stand out in the team and I want to be fast tracked for promotion. I want to be a top contender. Is this how things work? Does this help me? So let's say I go and I talk to my boss and my boss tells me, look, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't make the final decision about who gets promoted in my team because sometimes it happens. But based on what you're telling me, here's what I can do. This is putting the coin back. I can write a glowing recommendation letter strongly saying that I do believe that you are the person. Of course, I got to believe that this is the person. Are you okay with this? Is this a good trade-off? Is this a good reciprocation for your effort? This is Chris telling his son, possibly. Do you know what possibly means? So when you calibrate that expectation, then you're in a better place. It's better than not saying anything and you're deep down, you're like, I'm doing everything. My bosses, look, everybody's seeing. They know what I want. Well, sometimes it doesn't work like that. So when you break the contract, or when they break the contract towards you, the feeling of frustration can be just so overwhelming. So I would say, yes, just go and have that conversation. Most people avoid that conversation because we don't like to think that we create obligations. This is such a heavy word, but we do. And the more you acknowledge that to yourself, the easier it is to start the conversation.
Yes. Okay. How do you give the confidence and motivation to new team members to go beyond the bare minimum in their roles?
I would say that's another excellent question. I would say if you ask me personally, and this is a philosophy that I have, I always give first. I always give first. So in a new relationship, if I'm the boss, I try as hard as I can to not take the coins out. I always put coins in first. I want to build that credibility. I want to help the team. I want to be the guy in a curling match. And I'm not the one throwing the stone. I'm the one with the broom, trying to clear the way and have my team do their work. So if you ask me, this is what I do. I give first, and by giving first, you create a reciprocity relationship. Your team is looking as like, okay, credit score goes up. This is a good guy. So that's my go-to strategy. I always give first, and I rely on the team having this reciprocity with myself, and it works like a charm.
Okay. I love this next question. What happens if you inherit someone's piggy bank? Um, there are past favors there and expectations there. What do you do?
It happens a lot. It happens a lot. As a matter of fact, it's more common than forming your own team, right? And I would say it all starts with understanding, reading between the lines, what was the past relationship these people had with their teams, with their bosses. It's like when you go in on a new romantic relationship, and let's say your new romantic partner had a very bad history with her or his ex. Understanding what happened is very valuable to you in moving forward. The same goes to your team. If there was a past history, either positive or negative, you have to understand why the contract that these people have with their bosses is formed the way it is. Why is it so transactional? What happened or what didn't happen? Or why is it so relational? And is it something that I can deliver to this team? So understanding, I would say, don't be afraid of asking questions about how was the previous relationship, because that's going to give you miles and miles of information to design your relationship with your team.
So basically, you have to be brave
Oh, you do have to be brave
and vulnerable.
and vulnerable, because sometimes you can say, look, I'm coming fresh to this team. I know you guys had an excellent boss, because I know people talk about this person. It happens. I will try my best to step up. And I want to know, what did you do right that worked? What can we keep doing? So this vulnerability of, coming to this relationship and be willing to learn. And this is what I like about science. You think like a scientist. You have to be willing to be contradicted. You have to be willing to accept new evidence and say, okay, I'm going to have to tweak this. I'm going to have to change a little bit here and there. But this learning and vulnerability, it's very, very powerful, I would say.
Okay, Leanne says you're putting in all the hard work. You're not getting any returns. You're not getting any coins. How do you bring up Exprocity with your boss? How do you turn it
Uh,
around?
from the employee point of view, is that it?
Yeah.
It will happen, and that's when people sometimes change jobs. And this is this is kind of a good news, bad news type of thing, because if you do have a boss that doesn't understand this relationship, or to be fair, my question would be, does your boss know that? Does he know? Does she know that this is happening? Because if the answer is no, then it's kind of unfair. Like he cannot see the crystal ball. But let's say they do, and they're acting in bad faith, like breaking reciprocity. This is what shatters relationship. And I'm sorry to say that to you, but some people, they will never engage in a relationship like this. So you have two options. Either you look for a new relationship, or you become exclusively transactional. It's like, oh, now you need me. You need me for overtime. I'm sorry, but I'm going to I'm skiing on the weekend. So no can do. And it gives you a bit of pleasure because that's how we restore equity in that relationship. And that's when things really don't work. This is the opposite of team effectiveness in that sense.
There's a lot of comments in the chat about equity, not equality, about treating people equally, but equally does not mean the same.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's it.
And Rafael speaks to the amazing concept of the group charter.
Yes.
We're just about at the end of our time, and there are no questions now, so it's a good time to stop. Thank you so much, Professor Chiuzi, for that wonderful talk.
It was my pleasure.
It was so enjoyable.
Yeah, I'm happy
But
everybody was here with us. It was a nice evening.
yes, so this brings us to the end of our program for tonight. If you have feedback, please send us feedback. We love to hear it. Good night, everybody, and thank you, everybody, for coming.